Hey everybody, welcome back to the Velvet Ashes Legacy Podcast. This is Denise Beck, and I'm here with Sarah Hilkeman and Dr. Laura Chevalier-Beer. Tables are turned a little bit this month. Usually, Dr. Laura is doing the hosting, but this time she is going to be the one that's being interviewed. So we're so excited to have you guys here today. Hello, ladies.
Hi there.
Hey, Denise.
All right, so this is fun. I haven't been on with you guys in a long time. I get to join your party. Thanks for letting me.
Yeah.
Okay, so Laura, tell us a little bit about who we're going to be talking about this month and why she was important to you, that we need to hear her story.
Yeah, so the figure that we're talking about today is F. Grace Allen, and she always went by Grace, but her first name was Frances, so in official records you see her as F. Grace, but we'll call her Grace. And she's someone that I encountered when I was doing doctoral research back in 2017. And my research was focused on finding people who worked with children, particularly around the turn of the 20th century. And there were lots of different denominations that I actually went and did research with. And Grace Allen is actually part of the Free Methodist Church. And so if you are not Free Methodist, you might not have heard of her, but if you are, she might be one of the saints that you look up to. And one of the reasons I wanted to highlight her this month is because I've been trying to, with guest speakers and with my own presentations, kind of give us a representation across denominations so that people who are coming at mission history and their own mission experience from different backgrounds will see themselves represented and see their denominations represented. So we've had Baptists, Methodists, Congregationalists, we had a Wesleyan, Pentecostals, independent missionaries. So this is a time where we're focusing on Free Methodists today. And
so good.
One of the reasons I really enjoyed learning more about Grace Allen's story was because she worked in South Africa. And I've spent a little bit of time in South Africa and have had a long-term, lifelong interest in that part of the world. My own mission experience was in East Africa, but in my research, I wasn't really able to find much for East Africa with the constraints that I had. And so in my dissertation, I focused more on Southern Africa. So that's why we're hearing about Grace today. She's someone that I got to know through the archives. And I did want to mention that it was the Marston Memorial Historical Center where I found those archives, and that they housed the archives of the Free Methodist Church, and they happen to be here in Indianapolis, Indiana, where I live. And I came here way before I moved here to do my research, and now that I'm back here, it's kind of interesting that
Convenient.
Yeah. So I just want them to know that I'm thankful because I'm still using some of those archives even now. So if you're a Free Methodist, this one's for you today. If you're not, I hope you also enjoy learning more about this history from South Africa and Grace Allen's story.
Laura, I just want to say, I think it's so good. You said having that representation of the different denominations and also different, we would say passport cultures today, but people who are from different parts of the world as well and who worked in different parts of the world. And so it just gives us a peek into the ways that God has worked, through the centuries, but then also in different parts of the world and, maybe in a denomination that we know nothing about. So I love that whether it's feeling like we are represented or learning something totally new, that these stories are so powerful. Mm-hmm. Well, Laura, let's jump in. What can you tell us about Grace's early life? How did she start out?
Yeah, so I mentioned she was born Frances Grace Allen, but went by Grace most of her life. And she was born on July 12th in 1864 in Palmyra, Michigan. At the time of her birth, her dad, Ira B. Allen, was actually fighting in the Civil War. So that just gives you an idea of the time frame and the time period we're talking about. And her father, when he wasn't fighting, was a farmer when she was very young. Her mother, I don't have a name for her, but she was actually from Ontario, Canada, and was Dutch and English background. So Grace was had a mixture of background there. And the records kind of got me confused for a minute until I stopped to think about it, but she is said to be the 8th of 11 children. But then other people say she was the second youngest in her family. And so for a minute, it confused me. And then I realized, not all of her siblings survived to adulthood. Sure. And so I think probably both of those things were true. She was the 8th child of her parents, but growing up, amongst her siblings and into adulthood, she ended up being the second youngest that lived. So a very large farming family that she came from. And she described her parents as, quote, old-fashioned shouting Methodists. So if you know anything about church history, especially here in the United States, Methodists back in the day when they were first kind of forming, they were known as like the revivalists, the people who were the holy rollers. They'd get really excited in their worship and in their prayer. These days, that's maybe not as characteristic of them, but back in the day it was. So yeah, the generations back to the Wesleys, we're talking like American Revolution time period is when the Methodist Church formed in the United States. Because before that, they were all Anglicans, and you couldn't be a loyalist and still be part of the American Revolution and part of the Anglican Church. So they kind of broke away during that time period. So we're talking like 1780s, and there is when the Wesleys were alive. So several generations back, they could trace themselves to the Wesleys and their influence. So the Allen family attended the Methodist Episcopal Church, and her father, besides being a farmer, he was also a local Methodist preacher for many years. So back then, it was very common for Methodist preachers to be bivocational. So they'd travel around and preach in the area, but they'd also, just have their regular job or profession that they were doing. And Ira Allen led his family in morning and evening prayers throughout Grace's childhood, and so that had a big impact on her faith development. Interesting story that she tells in her autobiography is that she remembers her first sin and punishment of that sin at age 3. I don't know how many of you can think back to
right?
That.
Yeah.
Like had an infraction and you remember the consequence, but I think it was so ingrained in her mind because it was so deliberate, and she was caught and she had consequences because of it. But she describes herself as noticing that the sugar box or the sugar that was kept was not tightly covered, and she saw as a little child that it was open, like it was usually shut. So she sticks her hand in and she takes some sugar, shoves it in her mouth, and her mom comes back and asks her what she's doing. And she can see the evidence, but Grace lies, and so she's caught stealing and lying, and then she's punished because of that. And it made an impression on her that she remembered much, much later in life. But she remembered just the being able to sense the presence of God from a very early age too. As a young child, she remembered being really afraid of the wind at night. And one night when it was particularly fierce and her older sisters were asleep beside her, she couldn't sleep because she was so scared. And she remembers praying to Jesus, "Oh, Jesus, take me in your arms." And she believed that he did, and she went to sleep safely, feeling like she was held in his arms. And I just think that's so precious to hear of a young child's faith like that, and how it kind of stayed with her throughout her life.
What I appreciate about this is that the remembering your sin as a child and this idea of Jesus being with her, I have heard stories of people in my generation that those kinds of things have also impacted, asking Jesus to hold their hand when they're scared at night, and, remembering early punishments. And it's just like this thing that's like, we are all human and we experience the same thing, even though she was born however many 150 years ago. It's like the same things we experience that can draw us close to the Lord and pull us into his story. And that's just, I don't know, it's a little bit comforting that we all get to experience that.
Yeah, just that lineage throughout history of we're human and we're connected to the same God, and he's convicting of us of sin, and he's also right there with us.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just impressed that she remembers something from when she was 3. That I don't know. I have memories.
Do you remember something? You don't?
No, I don't think so. Not that little.
I remember when I was a year and a half, and I know you guys don't think that's true, but I have a vivid memory.
Wow.
Yeah. I sometimes wonder if the kids now, with all the video and the pictures that they're going to have of their growing up years, if they'll have an even, it'll be more vivid that they can remember back further. Because
that's true. It's all implanted.
Yeah.
That'll be a fun study. Okay, so were there any other pivotal moments in her growing up years that kind of, helped shape her life?
Yeah. So one major thing that happened to her in her family was that during the final years of her father's service in the Methodist Church, he actually faced some persecution and censure because he was a holiness preacher, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But he also refused to support secret society preachers, which were kind of up and coming in that time of history. For example, the Freemasons. So, in a short autobiography that Grace wrote, she said that her father was put on trial by the church, and apparently he had some enemies who tried to turn him out of the church on these charges. But they didn't succeed, but this led to her parents deciding to leave the church and join the Free Methodists. And this happened when Grace was about 7 years old. Now, the Free Methodists, if you don't know their history, they formed about 1860 in Pekin, New York, and the leaders broke away from the Methodist Episcopal Church, and they had coalesced around concern for the poor and this idea of being free. And they felt that they were honoring the true tenets of Methodism established by Wesley. So some of the ways that they thought that they were going to be more free, one was a big one. At the time, the Methodist Episcopal Church was still supporting slavery in the South. And so the Free Methodists were an abolitionist holiness denomination, just like the Wesleyan Methodists that we've talked about in previous podcasts. Another thing that they wanted free were pews. At that time, it was really common for pews to be sold or rented. And so that became a division on socioeconomic class. And so they didn't like that. They also wanted freedom in worship and freedom similar to her dad from secret societies that often required some sort of oath, and they just wanted to be free to be loyal to Christ alone. Another area was that they wanted freedom from what they considered abuse by ecclesial authority, and the history was that the Methodist Episcopal Church had expelled 120 leaders and lay people around 1860, and that those people then went and formed the church. And then finally, this is a very, very much a holiness tenet. They desired members to experience entire sanctification. And that term was the holiness movement's way to describe kind of a deeper life with Christ, where you experience more freedom to live fully as he desires you to live, and more empowerment to do that. So you can see why her dad and mom decided to join the Free Methodists. It really aligned with a lot of their beliefs.
I was just going to say, so she is no stranger to things many people today are going through with, issues with the church and questioning, do I believe what my church is doing is right? And I feel like, that's a common theme we hear, even people that are returning to a church that sent them out, and they're just asking all of these questions. And so I feel like this is nothing new. What we are going through today is nothing new. Even just to hear that, Grace, she had to deal with that.
Yeah, for sure. And the leader of the Free Methodists during the early years was B.T. Roberts, and he was one of those 120 that were expelled. And interestingly, later in 1910, the Methodist Episcopal Church decided that they had been wrong, and they reinstated his credentials. So it's an interesting history loop there that they realized, maybe we didn't do the right thing. So that was all happening around the time that Grace was 7, we said, where her parents decided to leave the church that they had known and move to a different one. And as a child for education, Grace attended the first term of Spring Arbor Seminary. If any of you are familiar with Spring Arbor University, it's one of the Christian liberal arts schools. It's in Michigan. And its early history was that it was just a primary school that kids attended as a boarding school. But when she was 11, the family ended up moving to Kansas. And in Kansas, her father started being an itinerant preacher again, this time for the Free Methodist Church. And he did that for about 20 years. Around the age of 13, Grace actually reports that she had her first conversion. And this is kind of typical language in the holiness movement of that kind of being reconverted more than once. But the interesting thing is that it was actually through a revival meeting that was held by a Baptist pastor. So you imagine her father, who's been a Methodist Episcopal, and now he's a Free Methodist, and she's going over to the Baptist. And she and her sister actually decided to join the Methodists, and they asked their father for permission, and he let them. Um,
It's how church girls rebel. They go to
yeah,
the other church.
yeah. But she describes that time as an immediate sliding back of just reverting to everything that she'd always been doing. In that time period, sliding back could involve things like dancing and playing cards and attending parties or the theater. These are things that many Christians today are less concerned about, but back at that time period, those were some of the, big sins that you could commit.
Mm-hmm.
And it was considered very worldly.
Mm.
But when she looks back on that first conversion, even though it didn't stick, according to her, she did see it as a turning point. She just found it hard as a child to forsake everything to follow Christ. So as she got older into her teenage years, she became interested in teaching. So even while she was still finishing up high school at the age of 15, she started working as a teacher. And she did that for about 8 months before she was even 16. And then when she reached her senior year of high school, she decided to do that again. And then she graduated and began studying to be a licensed teacher. And she enrolled in a teacher training courses, and she would teach in the winter and go to her classes in the summer. So by the time she was in her late teens, early 20s, she was, working as a teacher. She talks about reclaiming her conversion at a revival meeting when she was 19. Her father was there. And then in 1886, when she turned 22 or 23, it's not sure. I'm not sure what time of year it was. So if she had already turned 22 or 23, but the sources say different things. But she was teaching at that time in McPherson, Kansas, and she attended a camp meeting. And this was a very typical kind of Christian gathering where people would come and hear a preacher, and many people would be, convicted of sin and decide that they wanted to dedicate their life to Christ in a new way. And for holiness advocates, as I mentioned before, this idea of sanctification, how they used the term was to experience this deeper connection with God and more of His grace, to be able to have a clean heart and be able to live for Him. So she experienced this at the age of 22 or 23, and she describes it like this, quote, "See, I was seeking the blessing of a clean heart. The Lord filled my soul with His perfect love and also highly honored me, unworthy as I was, by calling me to work for Him in the foreign field," unquote. So not only did she feel this kind of cleansing in her soul and this empowerment to live for Him, she also felt a call to be a missionary, and that was not uncommon as well. So she immediately applied to the Free Methodist Missionary Board and was so eager that she decided that she would pay her own way to the field, even though she didn't have any money in hand at the time. So she thought she'd earn it by teaching. So yeah, just to round out kind of a summary of those early years, looking back on them, she shared kind of her motivation and what was going on in her heart. This was much later in life, but she said, quote, "I can truly say with St. Paul that when it pleased God, who called me by His grace to reveal His Son to me, that I might preach Him, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood. I went at His bidding, not asking how I was to be supported or what the fare would be, but joyfully following my Savior whithersoever He should lead. I have never for a moment regretted my obedience to the heavenly vision. As the years go by, I find my zeal for the Lord's work in this dark land does not grow less, but rather increases. I have a deeper love than I had when I first came out, and my constant and greatest desire is to spend and be spent for the salvation of the benighted sons and daughters of Africa." So that just gives you a little bit of where her heart was at and kind of how she was thinking about going out and how it just continued to increase as the years went by.
Well, and you said this was after she'd been there for decades. So how long does she end up serving?
Yeah, so the crazy part is that she spent 53 years of her life in Southern Africa. A couple coming back and forth to the U.S. a few times in there, but a total of 53 years on the field.
Wow.
She lived to the age of 92 as well. So
Laura, you said that she immediately applied to the Free Methodist Missionary Board, which that's just so interesting to me that was like her response to the way that God was working in her heart. But so the Free Methodists had a missions board, so they were obviously sending people or focused on that. They weren't really that old at this point, right? Like
Right. So the Free Methodists formed in 1860. They had a missionary interest before that, but in terms of
Okay.
sending missionaries out, they had just barely sent their first team.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I'll
So
tell you about that a little bit here.
okay. Do you know what her exposure would have been to missionaries or any kind of mission work?
So my guess is within the Methodist Episcopal Church, she would have probably had some exposure, but she was still very, very young when she was in that church. I'm not sure what it would have looked like in the Free Methodist because, as I said, they didn't start sending out missionaries from their board until right before she went out. So it would have probably been more independent people. But also, there's cross-denominational things happening. Like I said, she went to a Baptist revival meeting, and there's other churches around. So I'm sure she had some exposure because evangelicalism has always been across denominations involved in missions.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't have any specific instances that I know of where she did have exposure.
Okay, so Grace has this call and zeal if she's going to go, even if she doesn't have the money. Can you talk about those early years for her in Africa and, where did she go and kind of what were those early years like for her?
Yeah. So she initially went to Portuguese East Africa, which is modern day Mozambique, to a coastal outpost about 600 miles north of Durban, South Africa. And the place was called Inhambane. This was actually where the Free Methodists had sent their first missionary group back in 1885. They had sent a party with two couples and a young man named Harry Agnew. And the party really knew nothing about how to prevent malaria, and they all became sick. And then one of the couples ended up going down to South Africa. And one was in Portuguese East Africa, and Harry was there as well. And they had to leave due to illness. So Harry's left here alone.
Mm.
So the second group was sent to the same place in Hambane, Portuguese East Africa, to kind of help him and support him. And they were just as ill prepared as the first group. There were six adults, two couples, and two single women, one of whom was only 18. Grace is about 23, 24 at this point in 1888. And then there was also three children. So few preparations had been made for them. You're going out to, remote places. There's mud huts, no furniture, just grass matting in wooden frames. And so it's pretty tough. But Grace immediately began to learn about the local Gitonga language through a copy of the Gospel of Matthew. So there's, previous missions that have been there and they've done some work of translation. So she has a Gospel of Matthew and a few hymns and 100 question catechism that she uses to help start learning the language. And she actually found the language pretty easy to learn and to read it, at least, because it was very phonetic. So she could read it even without fully understanding it. And I can relate to that experience because that was similar to the languages I learned in East Africa. So she and this other single female missionary started reading the catechism to the crowds that would gather. And the questions they were asking were such as, who is God? The answer is our Father in heaven. Or another question would be, when did he begin to be? And the answer would be, he never began to be. So these were just ways that people had to kind of teach some doctrine and help people just learn through memorization. And they were using it also to learn how to speak the language. So it started off kind of, with high hopes, learning the language. They're roughing it a bit, but it turned pretty difficult pretty quickly through loss and hardship. In less than 3 months, one of the couples actually had died and the other had to leave. The couple that passed away were called the Lincolns, and Mrs. Lincoln had given birth to a baby boy, and that infant died very soon after he was born. And Grace was called to care for this missionary lady, and she seemed to recover enough so that by June 18th, Grace had returned to her own home. But then this lady, Mrs. Lincoln, grew sick again, passed away. And then 6 weeks later, her husband also died. Probably, he's traumatized by the death of his wife, but he was also sick too. And then Harry Agnew, the guy that they've all come to kind of help him get going, he goes to the U.S. to be married. So Grace is left here at 23, 24 with an 18-year-old coworker, and they really have nothing. And so they realize that it's not safe for them to stay by themselves, so they move to a different station run by the American board. So fortunately, there were some seasoned missionaries around who kind of took care of them and took them under their wing.
Mm-hmm.
And that was for a year or two, I believe, or I guess about a year. And then Harry returns with his bride, and I mean, just tragedy after tragedy. His wife dies very quickly from fever.
Oh my goodness.
So this is just a very discouraging time, and they all thought about quitting. And it really just came down to them not knowing what they needed to do about tropical diseases. We can look back on it and be like, how could they not know? But we're standing here with, knowledge that people had to learn the hard way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the turning point really came when the mission board finally learned how to guard against malaria, and they built mosquito-proof buildings in Hambane.
Can I ask a question right there? The mission board, is that back in
that's
States?
back in the U.S.
How are they learning about malaria and informing the people on the ground?
I don't know how they learned about it, but that's what the record reads. Grace said the board was the ones who helped them know what to do.
Who told them to build?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I don't know if the other missionaries that were there from other groups didn't know as well, or what the deal was exactly, but it seemed like a lack of knowledge was part of the problem.
Yeah, for sure.
So Harry, who's, lost all these colleagues and lost his wife, he continued to work, and other missionaries came, and the work finally starts to flourish after so much tragedy and loss. And looking back, actually, Grace comments that this work in Hambane was the greatest work that the Free Methodist Church did in Africa, because eventually there were over 200 Christian villages who had a preacher to care for them. So it eventually grew to be a thriving work. But her time in Portuguese East Africa didn't continue. So after just about a year and a half, she was transferred to Fairview Mission Station, which was actually in South Africa, modern day South Africa. And she spent the majority of her missionary career there. But she always held a very special place in her heart for Mbane, and she was able to return there later in life in around 1930 for a visit. So yeah, just a really crazy kind of introduction to cross-cultural work and kind of the cost involved at that time in history.
Yeah, it's such a reminder of, like, literally people went knowing chances are we're not going to come back, and just that the perseverance and the gift, I feel like that the Lord allowed her to see such fruit, because I feel like there's so many times that we go and serve and carry the wounds and don't see the fruit, and just, the gift there. Yeah. Okay. So did Grace teach? Like, what kind of work was she doing there?
Yeah. So in 1890, she moved to Fairview Mission Station. This was located in Hebridean, Natal, South Africa. I apologize to those who have South African background. I don't know if I'm saying those all properly, but that was just south of Durban, near the east coast of South Africa, modern day South Africa. When she first arrived, she actually had to build a mud hut, a mud and sticks house, because that was all that they had available. But she had the help of the first convert of the mission there. He would carry heavy timbers and set posts in the ground, and they would weave sticks together, plaster it with mud, and thatch the roof. And some friends from home sent her money for things like doors, windows, and wood flooring. And they also built a kitchen outside. So she was very thankful when this mud house was finally built, because she had been staying in another mud hut that had a soggy floor when it rained. So it was fine. Dry season was hard, but when it rained, it would just get muddy. So this new house that was built, she felt like it was a palace. And she had a local woman named Martha that would stay with her and worked with her. So I'm not clear what her original charge was, other than just to preach the gospel. But local girls began to visit her and ask if they could stay and learn and become Christians. they would arrive wearing nothing but cotton blankets, according to her report, and she'd allow them to stay and, learn from her, but she only allowed a few to stay overnight, and she let them sleep in her kitchen, and then she would teach them in the living room in her house. And then with other missionaries that were there, they also built a round native hut with a door and windows that they used as a schoolhouse during the week. And then for kids who would come and study during the day, and then they'd held services there on Sundays for Sunday services. And people would just sit on mats on the floor, grass mats, and Grace remembers just having revival meetings in that hut. And some of the boys who were saved through those meetings became ministers later. So early on, Grace is housing girls in her home, and there's tons more that want to come. But she knew that the mission board didn't really have funds to help build a home for girls. They barely had funds to support their missionaries. So she decided to pray. And she enlists all the girls to help. She tells them, okay, we have to pray and that the Lord's going to give us the means to build a schoolhouse and a home for you and the other girls. And so they would pray day after day for this home to be built for the girls. And she ended up drawing up a plan, like making her own plan, building plans, and that had a schoolroom, a sleeping room, a dining room, a kitchen, a sitting room, 2 bedrooms for herself, kind of like it had a school area and an area for her and her helper. That was a little bit separate. And she thought, oh, this is just going to be, a stick and mud kind of structure. And she talks about it saying, my faith did not reach higher than that. But then she goes on to describe that she set aside a day to fast and pray for the building. And she took the plans and umbrella kind of to block herself from the sun. And she brought it to the place where she hoped to build this structure. And she prayed and prayed and prayed until she felt like she had an answer from the Lord. And within a year, she reported that the building was built, and it wasn't made of sticks and mud, but it was made out of bricks. So that was just an amazing testimony to the power of prayer and how God provided for them in their need.
Yeah.
Well, she says she doesn't have faith. She didn't have enough faith to ask for something greater, but she literally had the faith to draw the plans and believe that this was going to happen. I feel like she did have faith, but I love that God just was like, nope, it's not big enough.
Yep.
Yeah.
And she said the way that it happened was, she doesn't have a lot of the deep details, but there was a man who had written an interesting book, she calls it. We don't know what the book was. We don't know what it was
so
about.
Mysterious.
But he had written an interesting book, and he heard about their need to build a school. And so he donated 2,500 of his books to be sold on behalf of the mission and this school. And so the Women's Missionary Society of the Free Methodists, that was just beginning around this time, she said, quote, they got busy and sold the books and sent us the money. And then when the mission secretary arrived and organized, he organized for the bricks to be made, and the building was built right on the mission property. And they named it Fairview Girls Home for girls, or Fairview Girls Home. And then other missionaries took charge of the day school, and Martha helped Grace run the home, and they had their own school there for the girls.
Wow. So this man with his interesting, mysterious book, and the Women's Missionary Society, this is all happening in the U.S., right? And then they were sending the money for her to, okay. Yeah.
And so the school that was the mud structure is a separate thing, and then this home is going. So they're two going on at the same time.
So yes, so there's a day school that's going on, and then there's this home that has kind of like a boarding school going on.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly why they kept the two schools separate, but there must have been a different need in terms of the education, or also just a different flow to the day for people who were living there versus people who were coming and going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do we know anything about the girls? You said there were other girls that wanted to attend, and do we know anything about them?
Yes. Initially, Grace said that all the boarders were girls who had run away from home for one reason or another. And so they were often marginalized in some way and looking for an alternative to the life that was kind of dealt with them. For example, they're sometimes running from an unwanted marriage to an older man. Often, however, they were running away from maltreatment by relatives. So here's an example that Grace shared. The girl's name was Noma Tikiti, and her story appeared in the Missionary Tidings, the Free Methodist missionary periodical. And Grace said, "This girl is about 13 years old. Her father is dead, and her mother married again and went away to live at another kraal. The child, according to custom, was left at her brother's to be brought up, and she suffered a good deal when small from want of care, as her sister-in-law did not trouble herself to attend to a child that was not her own. She says when she used to see other children's mothers give them choice bits of food or other favors, she would think, why cannot I have a mother to give me good things? Her brother finally consented for her to come here to live. She is a real earnest Christian and a very lovable child." So that's just one example of a story of how a child would come to them. And not all the scholars at the Free Methodist schools arrived under such dire circumstances. Besides those living on the margins in their communities, there's often leaders who are approaching missionaries about sending their own children to the mission schools because they want them to be able to learn to read and to interact with Westerners who are coming into their lands. And there was just other children who wanted to learn to read because they wanted to, and they coaxed their parents to allow them to go to school. So there's a range of reasons and motivations for kids, for children and young adults coming to the schools. In other parts of Africa, particularly West Africa, some missionaries actually redeemed children who warring ethnic groups had enslaved. So, you've got a group over here and they capture some slaves, and so they're, not part of that group. And they're probably not treated super well. And so missionaries would find out about these cases and sometimes try to buy them so that they could set them free and to help educate them. So that's another way that African children sometimes came to be attending mission schools. But the vast majority, I would say, were coming because they were looking for some new way of doing life. Either they wanted to read or they wanted to get away from the circumstances that they were dealt. And just the African landscape at this time in history is changing dramatically. It's colonialism is happening, and that's changing the dynamic across the continent. And it's different in different localities, but it's something that's in common across sub-Saharan Africa.
I mean, that emphasis is still there, I think, even today, just the desire among, expats, but also nationals of we want our children to be educated. We feel like this is the key to a better life. And, so I can totally see the draw of this, facility, the structure, these resources have come and just, all that it brings. But one of the things that I latched onto was, so literally, Laura, this podcast is telling the story of people because we believe that the stories impact and inspire and give people courage. And so you mentioned the Missionary Tidings magazine or articles or something where these stories, I'm assuming, were then, spread out and delivered to people. Can you tell us any more about that?
Yeah, so the Missionary Tidings is one of many mission periodicals that were prevalent during that time in history. So letter writing was the main way that people were communicating across oceans and across continents. And so missionaries at this time are prolific with their writing. They're handwriting, most of them. Some of them are typing, but they're sending them back to their mission boards, back to their supporters, sending them to other parts of the world trying to gain support. But then often, especially amongst denominations, they would put them into a periodical. So either a monthly or sometimes even a weekly magazine that would be sent out to all of their constituents. So for the Free Methodists, that was called the Missionary Tidings. And so Missionary Tidings began in 1897. And that's 9 years after Grace initially went to Africa. And it was the main mission periodical for the Free Methodist Church. And it was actually the leading women of the Women's Foreign Missionary Society of the church that edited it. So many of them were married to the male leaders of the denomination. But they would publish letters and updates mostly from Free Methodist missionaries, but also from other independent missionaries who would just send them stuff. And their purpose was to share the news of what was happening in the foreign lands in order to encourage prayer and material support for these missionaries. But they're also wanting to encourage the people in their church, in their faith, in their zeal for missions. And their publications often included stories about life in other parts of the world. So they're kind of the vehicle for the exchange of stories, for the exchange of cultural information. And they're the ones kind of the keepers of this. They decide what to publish. They decide what to edit. It's very interesting dynamic. But interestingly, one of the things that they took upon themselves to do was to really engage with the children, the child readers that they knew were reading the magazine or having read to them. And so they would have articles and parts of the magazine that would be dedicated to children, and they would solicit, I think, some of the content so that it would be specific for children. So Grace was a prominent contributing author for the Missionary Tidings, and she would submit her own articles, her own stories, and then she'd also submit translated letters written by her students. And she would encourage her audience, especially the American audience, to think about what it would be like to go to school all day in a language that's not your own language, because in their schools, they're teaching the girls English. And the other scholars in the day schools, the boys also are learning English. And she'd often ask her readers to withhold judgment about differences in food and other practices that might seem strange. Some of the way that she writes we wouldn't find acceptable today. She uses language that we would find unhelpful and honestly just not what we would consider to be okay today. But if you try to get at the heart behind it, her heart was always to kind of uplift and help people, uplift the image of people in other lands to the Western audiences, so that they would value them to the same way that they would their own children, their own people. She would often point out, these children can learn just as much as your children can. They can be as smart or even smarter than the children that you know.
Great.
That kind of thing.
Well done.
Yeah. So in the first issue of the Missionary Tidings, there's actually a section dedicated to the children, and on the second page, it features Grace and her students. It contains letters and testimonies from the Zulu mission children that Grace worked with. And she provided an introduction, a commentary, and a translation. And then there's this letter from the youngest mission girl, who's age 7. And she tells the readers, she's living on the mission. She says she loves the Lord and she wants to be a good girl. And she's the only one in her tribe who wears clothes. And so these are the kinds of things that they're hearing about. And it seems clear that this child knows that she's writing to other Free Methodist children in other parts of the world, because she calls them children. In another early issue of the Missionary Tidings, Grace tells the story of actually reading the first issue to her schoolgirls. And so she talks about how she reads the issue to her girls, and they're really interested in an account of the Chinese children that is in the magazine. And they seem so shocked about how the girls are treated and how they have to have their feet bound. And Grace talks about how one little girl in her home who has scars on her face and large holes in her ears, which to Grace feels like, someone has mutilated her face. At that time period, it would have felt like that. She talks about how this little girl is expressing great astonishment about how cruel the Chinese children have been treated. And the girls that night, she reports, are praying earnestly for the children. They had read a story about a Chinese boy who was whipped because he went to a Christian meeting. And she talks to her audience again about how American children might be shocked about some of the ways that the African children are treated. And she even tells her girls that, just to try to get people to start thinking about how cultures are different and how things are acceptable in one culture or not in another. And I just think it's an interesting study of how cross-cultural information was shared and kind of interpreted. And how you think about how some of these practices have since changed, the influence of cross-cultural contact and people realizing, we can do things differently. So some of these practices don't exist anymore.
Right. Yeah. It's not the vehicle or the way that I would have thought about these different, these girls in South Africa learning about something that was happening in China. And so I love that.
Right.
Yeah, it was not just something that was a way for stories from the field to be shared with people, maybe in the United States context, but that there was so much more to it of sharing these stories and being encouraged, or just learning about a place in the world that was different from their own context, which is really cool and just speaks to the power of story.
Yeah, and we talked today about how global Christianity is, and how it has local expressions, but it's a global religion, a global group of people. And you just see that happening at this time in history, that it's being formed.
Yeah, very cool. Talk a little bit more, Laura, about this girls' home, the Fairview home, like with the school. What did a school day look like? How did Grace run it?
Yeah, so Grace wasn't really the teacher. She was more of the administrator principal. So some of the missionaries I've highlighted, they were the ones doing all the teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that was the case with Grace as much. Her local helper, Martha, was more of the teacher, and Grace would take care of all of the other things going on. Her philosophy, her mission philosophy, kind of drove how she ran things. And it was shared by many other holiness advocates at home in the US and abroad. And this was this idea that we want to rescue children from the influences of harmful surrounding environment and culture and nurture them to know the Savior. And nurturing children spiritually was not only the right thing to do for children, but she felt it was the most effective mission strategy in making converts. She remarked later in her life that the history of mission works in all lands, so that children and young people are the first to receive the gospel. And she said comparatively few converts are made from those in adult life. So she's working with children and young people because she thinks it's effective. And this idea of rescuing young children or young people from the influences around them was not just in these foreign lands, in Africa because of some of the cultural things that they saw, or in China because of some of the cultural things they saw. It was also a philosophy that they were using in North America. And that's why you see some of these schools like Spring Arbor popping up. It was considered, this is a place where we can send my child and they'll be free from the harmful worldly things that could be out there that would draw them away from Christ. So it's a way to protect and nurture children. That was part of the mission philosophy. And I talk a lot about that in my dissertation. It can be problematic, as I'm sure some of you are thinking, but it's what motivated many of the missionaries. So one of the things that happens with this kind of missionary mentality is that missionaries would often take on the role of being kind of a surrogate parent to this children in their care, or the young people. And Western missionaries and many other settings and with other mission boards and agencies did exactly the same thing. And some of the things they would do as a surrogate parent, you might have no problem with, other things you might. So let's talk about some of that. So some of the things she did was to make sure the girls had things they needed, like food and shelter and clothing. Those are, basic needs. Great. She also took charge of their spiritual nurture and instituted morning and evening prayers. So it's kind of like running a Christian home, but with a bunch of girls who are not from your own family and who speak other languages, who come from other cultures. Now, as a surrogate parent, one thing that she did that we might find a little bit more problematic was that, and she wasn't the only missionary to do this, but she renamed some of the children. So it was a common practice around this time to give converts an English name at their baptism, kind of like a taking on a new identity. And because the gospel came to them through often English or other Western languages, their name would reflect that. So it would be an English or other Western language name. But sometimes children or young adults were given new names because it was deemed that their original name had a bad meaning. And sometimes the name that they were given in place was the name of like a pioneer missionary or important people in the church's history. So, for example, Grace named one girl Mays after the daughter of Amanda Smith, who we've talked about in this podcast before. And she was a famous African-American Methodist Episcopal evangelist and missionary. So today it kind of feels a little bit presumptuous that someone would do that. It feels disrespecting of culture and their heritage. And these days, it's not as common for children to be removed from their families either.
Right.
education. But at the time, and even today across Africa, boarding schools are very common. So culturally and historically, like at that time in history, it wasn't viewed quite the same as we would today.
Yeah. Laura, did you run into like any people that had a name that represented something bad when were spending your time in Africa?
Yeah, I remember when I was living in northern Kenya, I remember a coworker. So I mostly worked with local Kenyans, the work that I did. And one of my colleagues, his name meant monkey, and he did not like to go by his his name that his parents had given him, and so he would go by his English name.
Yeah.
But
Same.
it's very, very common, at least in Kenya where I was, to have 3 or 4 names. And then
Right.
people would want to call me some of my names that I don't use as well. So
Right. Yeah.
So in terms of like the schedule that the girls would keep, they would spend 4 to 6 hours working in the gardens and doing chores around the property, because this is a home that needs to run. Remember, they're not having electricity or running water or vehicles. They have to fetch the water. They have to find the firewood. And then in the afternoons, they would spend 5 or 6 hours in school and study. So that's a long day. And they would usually start that and end that with prayer.
Which is what her dad did in their family.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And Grace would often write updates and report about revivals taking place in the school. And so when these were going on, studies would be suspended and the girls would spend hours, like all day, every day in prayer. And many times they would devote their lives to Christ during these, special revival times. And that was common across missionary settings. And as the principal of the school, Grace had to keep really meticulous handwritten records, all of her expenses, plans, reports. And as she got older, that kind of task became a lot more of a weight and a burden for her.
Sure.
As I mentioned before, she's writing countless detailed, handwritten, and sometimes typed letters and reports. So this administrative weight comes through very clearly in the archival records, where you see how much volume she's having to produce to be able to communicate with her leaders. She had a responsibility to the mission board, but she also wanted others to know about their work and their needs so that they could support them. And for many years, the Free Methodist Mission Board had very few funds to support their missionaries. And then around the 1920s, when, stock market is going down and it's hard at home, like they're desperate. They don't have much. And so they often operated many of their projects on the by faith method, praying to God to supply for their needs. And one of the ways that the school and many other mission schools stayed open was by applying for and accepting grants from the government. And this helped them stay afloat, but it usually came with requirements about curriculum, language use, level of education, and all that. And again, this is something that you see across sub-Saharan Africa. And after many years, this government involvement actually led to the closing of Fairview Girls' Home. They felt it was redundant at some point. But for many years, Grace ran it, and it was a thriving school. So kind of backing up to Grace's life, within 5 years of establishing Fairview Girls' Home, Grace had become the missionary in charge of the entire mission station. And then many other missionaries came and went, and they would often depart due to ill health, but Grace remained and provided that leadership and stability and faithful service for many, many, many years.
Do you know if this position of leadership as a woman created any problems within the Free Methodist?
So that's a great question. One thing you should know about holiness denominations is they were much more egalitarian in their approach. Mm-hmm. And so women were able to be ordained. They were able to be preachers. And so this was much more common and much more acceptable.
Gotcha. Okay. So did she spend the rest of her career at Fairview?
I think she expected to, but the answer is no. Actually, in 1926, at the age of 62, so, she's starting to get up there, the Free Methodist Missionary Board asked her to transfer to Greenville Mission Station, which was in Pondo Land, further south of Durban and Fairview. And they asked her to do that to take care of a school for boys and girls and support the Native evangelists and teachers and outstations. And most of the teachers there were former schoolgirls of hers, interestingly.
Oh, wow.
So they needed someone to take over that work, and it had been started. They didn't want to kind of lose what had been done, and they thought Grace would be a good person to do that. But she was really concerned about leaving the missionary who was kind of running the school at that time, Daisy Frederick, there by herself. So she kind of wrestled through it, and you can see her back and forth with the mission board and like, is this going to really happen? And finally she accepted it. But as she's writing them, she said, I hope I can include boarders at the school in Greenville. So she wants to start a boarding school again. But some of the other missionaries within their conference didn't like that idea. But meanwhile, the board is quietly authorizing her to do that quietly. So, I mean, we've kind of touched on this already a bit, but the way the mission boards worked at that time was that the board is back in the US and they send out the missionaries, and the board is in charge of raising money for them, distributing it, and authorizing how it's used, and the missionaries then have to account back to them. So that's why there's all this back and forth going with the letters, but it takes time. And so meanwhile, decisions have to be made. So the missionaries in a locality have this conference where they make decisions. And so there's obviously disagreements that are happening, and there's time delays, and this is just a sticky dynamic that's going on. Just for example, at this time in Grace's career, she wrote a letter to the mission secretary expressing astonishment that other missionaries had reported her for breaking rules. So she's this seasoned missionary, and someone on her field is writing back to the United States saying, oh, she did something wrong. And so she's having to write back and be like, hey, I don't know what I did wrong, but this is what I have done. Tell me if I've done anything wrong. So she was actually defending herself for receiving funds. So someone was accusing her of soliciting funds kind of outside of the mission board structure. And she says, hey, people sent me money and this is what I did with it. Like, I didn't ask them for it, but.
Well, you wonder like what that triggered from her dad, being almost disbanded from his original congregation, affiliation. And so like, you wonder if that's like any triggering fears that she's reliving there.
Yeah, and it could have been, but if you read her letters, she's very humble about it, and just said, if I have done anything wrong, I'm sorry, but this is what I think I've done, and just very apologetic, but also defensive of like, hey, like, I'm your student missionary here who's been trying to do it right for a long time.
Trust me.
Yeah, so at this time, she's in her 60s. She's moved to her third location, and she's learning her third African language, and it's similar enough to Zulu that she can progress rapidly. And during this time in her ministry, one of her main achievements is that she oversees the making of a 20,000 brick building, and it's a Free Methodist church at the mission station. And later, others note that it's one of the loveliest churches in South Africa. So that's something that stands out from that time. Another incident that happened while she was at Greenville that she recounted on February 16th, 1928. She remembers the previous August being out, visiting outstations, and outstations were just those places where that kind of reported to a main mission hub, and those were smaller stations out further. So she had been visiting one of those, and the path was full of many steep hills, and there wasn't really a road. It was just a path with streams to cross. And she said 6 times she had to cross the same river. And she reported that her horse began to lag, and she had a hard time getting him to move, especially down hills. And as she urged the horse along, night began to fall, and she's still far from home, with many streams to cross, the hills to climb and descend, and it's very dark, and she couldn't see her way. So she's afraid of turning her ankle in the darkness, and the women that she had come with are kind of a bit ahead of her, and so she began to pray and sing. And this is what she reported. She said, all at once I was conscious of a strong man walking by my side. He was taller than any human being and reached up to my side as I sat on the horse. He was dressed like a soldier and strode along by my side. I did not see him with my natural eyes, but I felt his presence. So then she reported that her horse had no trouble walking after that, going up and down hills, through the streams, and her fear melted away, and she felt that she had been escorted by a heavenly escort. and she wept and praised God, and she made it safely home. And she remarked that she could say with Peter, "The Lord has sent his angel and delivered me." And she said she never had such an experience before of tangibly sensing the angel of the Lord. And this was not an everyday occurrence, but it was certainly memorable and encouraged her faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Love stories like that.
It kind of reminds me, though, of her, early memory of praying when she was scared of the
You're
wind,
right.
and just that, yeah, like that's where she turned to, was asking the Lord
Yeah.
for comfort, whether it was as a little girl afraid of the wind or, as a older woman in her 60s or whatever she was at this point. And just her faith.
Yeah, and it's just so sweet that God would meet her in that way.
Yeah.
As a seasoned missionary and like just having a little bit of a hard time, like needing that extra encouragement.
Yeah. Well, she has obviously given, so much of her life to work on the field. What were her later years? We've talked about kind of up through her 60s, or, that's the age that you've mentioned. What did her life look like for her?
Yeah, so interestingly, by 1934, it seems that she actually returned to Fairview Mission Station. I think probably because she was getting old. She couldn't keep doing all that kind of hard work where you're like traveling out to these remote areas. She was no longer the principal because, as I said, the school had closed by that time because it had come under government jurisdiction. So I'm not sure exactly how she served at that time, but I'm sure she was a mentor to the younger missionaries and local evangelists and preachers. So between 1888, when she first went out, and 1941, when she went back to the U.S., she spent most of her time in Africa. She had 4 furloughs during that time for a total of 53 years in the African field.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And so she returned to Oklahoma in the U.S. Due to health concerns in 1941. She went there because her elder sister was there, and so she ended up caring for her until that sister passed away. And then she lived in a deaconess home. The deaconesses were part of the Free Methodist mission, where they were serving in the local community amongst the poor often. So it was a place where she could stay and be cared for. And then later her niece, Ida Graham, cared for her in her home until her death in 1957 at the age of 92. And Ida remembers her aunt saying she had read through the Bible 57 times in her 92 years. And she loved reciting scriptures in English and in Zulu. And some of her favorites, I'm sure that some of you share, Isaiah 35 and then Psalm 23. She also enjoyed poetry and singing up until her final days. So she lived such a full, rich life.
Wow, yeah.
So, Laura, how would you sum up her legacy? This 92-year-old woman who spent 53 years in Africa. How would you sum up Grace Allen?
Yeah, so I would say the way I would sum it up is that she was a woman of long, faithful, and humble service, teaching and raising up the church in Southern Africa. And she touched thousands of lives with her work. When she moved to the United States, she received a letter from some of the former students that she had worked with. And I'd like to share a little snippet of that kind of in closing. This is the letter that some of the former African children had written to her. It says, "Lady, daughter of Allen, we hear of your illness, we your children whom you reared in the gospel and taught them from the beginning. We are sorrowing. We are hoping that the Lord of heaven will be with you in your illness and in your old age. We pray for you without ceasing. We tell our children about you. Your image is never hidden from us. Signed, we your children." And so it was signed by 9 of her former school children who had become preachers, evangelists, teachers, and Christian parents. So in Grace's work, she worked with school children who then, went on to start Christian homes and raise Christian children. She engaged in itinerant preaching, traveled to remote villages to preach and share the gospel. She trained and mentored Native evangelist teachers and other Christian workers. And she contributed to the growth and nurture of churches in South Africa and other parts of Southern Africa by training leaders and overseeing the construction of church buildings. In addition to all that, she trained and mothered countless younger missionaries and was auntie to their children. And she inspired her own biological nieces and nephews and generations of Free Methodists who read her stories and letters in the Free Methodist periodicals. So like her name, I would say she was full of grace and walked in the grace of the Lord. And I think that letter from her children really speaks to not only her mission philosophy, but just the legacy that she had.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Wow. I mean, I'm just inspired by her long obedience and
Yeah.
the trials that she went through. When you think about all that she witnessed, even what we were told about was in her early days, the tragedies, you can assume that there were many that we didn't hear about, but that they did not cause her to turn, that it caused her to just keep going. And if you think about if she had, when, you know, people were dying, when babies were dying, when couples were leaving, when, you know, all of this was happening, if she had lost courage, think about all the story that you just told that would not have happened, you know, all of those lives that were impacted. And I'm just so inspired by the staying power and what the fruit of that is in her life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the generational aspect of it, that it was, you know, she had this impact on these girls and these other young people who then grew up to be faithful themselves. It sounds like, you know, as they were evangelists and teachers and raising their own children to love the Lord. And so, yeah, even though, you know, she didn't get married or have her own children, like she has generations of impact through just her faithfulness.
Yeah, well, thank you, ladies, for letting me share her story with you and with our listeners today. It's just a privilege to be able to represent her and to let her story be heard.
Laura, thank you so much for helping us to know some of these stories that are buried a little bit maybe by church tradition, or for whatever reason, you help us dig them out and bring them back so that they can inspire courage in a whole new generation. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for letting me join you for this month and be a part of the fun. And thanks to you all for being a part of the Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast. We hope that you have taken a little nugget, that it's meant something to you, that it has inspired you, that it's given you courage. And we're so grateful to be here with you this month. We look forward to joining you next time. And as always, we want to give thanks to Barnabas International for making it possible for us to dig out these stories with you every month here on the Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast. We'll see you next time.